A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide.
You're together with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode in honor of the yard site of Rav Leib Malin is sponsored by 20 Minute Daf. 20 Minute Daf is a Daf Yomi Shir led by Reb Shol Greenwald, where you actually feel the geschmack of the limud as you go through the Daf together. In just a little over 20 minutes, you'll get a clear and thorough explanation of the sugya without wasting time on extras. Listen to 20 Minute Daf on all podcast platforms, on WhatsApp, or at 20minutedaf.com. It's actually 2 years basically to the day of starting the Daf Yomi cycle, so we're celebrating 2 years of doing Daf Yomi, and I personally am still doing it, going strong at it, and one of the reasons is because you have 20-minute Daf, and it just keeps you motivated, it keeps you going, knowing that you have this very clear and concise and, great shir that I highly recommend and personally get much benefit out of, and it keeps you going with the Daf Yomi. It's a long cycle, and you want to get to the finish line, you have to have a good shir that you're committed to. So the 20-minute Daf is definitely very convenient, very clear, and highly recommended. So we'll move along to the episode of today about Rav Leib Malin. A couple of months ago, for the Sukkot edition of the Mishpacha magazine, Davi Safir and I had the privilege of writing a very, I would say, groundbreaking article or landmark article about Rav Leib Malin, who nothing comprehensive has really been written about, especially in English. And this generated a lot of feedback and a lot of interest in doing an episode about him on the podcast. The original article is, of course, available on Mishpacha Magazine's website, and if you haven't read it yet, then I highly recommend you do so, as well as our weekly column, For the Record, in the Mishpacha Magazine of Davi and I. So this episode about Rav Leib Malin is not exactly based on the article. There is a lot from the article, but it's really much more. A lot that was, left on the cutting floor because of space considerations. I personally was always fascinated by Rav Leib, so it's not really a summary of the article at all. It's really an exploration behind the scenes. You ever see those little YouTube videos interviewing Spielberg about, what went on behind the scenes to create one of his movies? So this is the same idea, plus many additional, lahavdil, of course, many additional anecdotes and tidbits which didn't make it into the actual article due to space considerations. And I'm going to try to also give a much more broad retrospective analysis of him in his place in Jewish history of his time period. It's also a special yard site. It's yard site number 60, if I calculated correctly. So it's a landmark yard site. It's the 60th yard site today of Rav Leib Malin. Coming off of a recent trip, actually, before we get down to business. Really a fantastic trip, a shul from Los Angeles. A wonderful group, really had a lot of fun. There was great singing and great discussions. We started off with Reb Shaila of Karastir. We went on to the Chassam Sofer in Slovakia. Went to Nikolsburg in the Czech Republic, to the Szach in Holeshov. Then we went on to Poland, where we did Krakow, Auschwitz, Lezhensk, Lublin, Ger, Warsaw, and many other exciting places exploring Jewish history. So we had a lot of fun. And if you're one of those rare shuls that hasn't done a trip yet, then you might want to be in touch with me to organize one, because everyone is doing it, and it's really, really a transformative experience and very exciting. So we're going to move on to Rav Leib Malin, and as with most people of his time and place, his life was woven from a tapestry of three distinct narratives, and that is pre-war, during the war, and post-war. Those are the three chapters of Rav Leib Malin's life, and all of them were very exciting. So first, we'll delve a bit into his family background. His great-grandfather was Reb Isser Yehuda Malin, who was a rabbi in Brisk, and he had a son, Reb Yosef Shraga Malin, also a dayan in Brisk, and he had several children. His oldest son was Reb Avram Moshe Malin, who is a dayan in Bialystok. And it was his son that was Rav Leib Malin. So Rav Leib was born to his father, Reb Avram Moshe, in Bialystok in Poland. I believe that Rav Leib had an older brother also named Reb Isser Yehuda, who was a name for this great-grandfather, and he was a close student of Rav Yerucham Levovitz in the Mir as well, and I believe his notes were used by Reb Simcha Zissel Levovitz, Rav Yerucham's son, when he went to publish Rav Yerucham's works, his shmuzin, like he used Rav Leib's notes. He used the Malin brothers' notes, essentially. I think he left the yeshiva, the Mir, several years prior to the war, and he was killed in the Holocaust, according to my understanding of it. It could be I'm mixing up the relatives here, because there were several Isser Yehudas. For instance, Rav Leib's uncle was another Isser Yehuda. This Reb Yosef Shraga, the grandfather, had another son, Reb Isser Yehuda Malin. He was a dayan in Brisk on the same rabbinical court as Reb Simcha Zelig Rieger. And he was very close with the Brisker Rov, Reb Relvila Soloveitchik, who later on would become the Rebbe of Rav Leib Malin. So this Reb Isser Yehuda Malin, he and most of his family were killed during the Holocaust. And he's also named for the grandfather, the patriarch of the family, this Reb Isser Yehuda Malin. It seems, interestingly enough, that Reb Isser Yehuda Unterman, who was the chief rabbi in Israel, who was born in Brisk, and he may have been related somehow to the Malin family. It's unclear. He was also named for this original Reb Isser Yehuda Malin. So there's all these Reb Isser Yehudas running around. This Reb Isser Yehuda Malin, who was killed, had two sons, Nehemiah and Meir, and they did survive. At the war's outset, he sent them to escape with the Mir Yeshiva under the care of their first cousin, Rav Leib Malin. Rav Leib Malin was much older than his younger cousins, and these boys were in their teens. And Nehemiah and Meir stayed with the Mir through Shanghai and on to the United States. In the United States, they founded a yeshiva in Washington, D.C., of all places, which they named for their father. After their father, Reb Isser Yehuda, they also claimed that it was a continuation of the pre-war yeshiva in Brisk, which their father had been in charge of, and this was presumably was to be able to make it easier to obtain funding from the German Claims Conference as a result of the fact that it was a yeshiva that had been destroyed by the Nazis. Reb Nehemiah and Reb Meir Malin moved to Israel in the late 1970s, and Reb Nehemiah Malin goes on to found a yeshiva called Knesset Yehuda, named for his father, in the Sanhedrin Murchevet neighborhood in Yerushalayim. It was a yeshiva, then later was a kollel, later a cheder for younger children. It still exists as far as I know. Reb Nehemiah Malin passed away in 2013 he was about 94 years old. So these close relatives of Reb Leib were still around till recently. Either way, so that's the background of Reb Leib Malin. He himself, he studies in the Grodny Yeshiva, Reb Shimon Shkup, and his primary rise to prominence was in the Mir Yeshiva. He was he had a very close relationship with Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, the great mashgiach of the Mir. It was really Rabbi Yerucham and his close students who had the administrative role in running the yeshiva, both the day-to-day running the yeshiva, and also they were the ones who delivered the chaburas, the kind of like the informal classes, the shiurim of the yeshiva. So Rav Leib was very prominent in that circle of the close students of Rabbi Yerucham. And the void that was left following Rabbi Yerucham's passing in the summer of 1936 was very great. And therefore it was unclear who would fill this gaping void, and it wasn't an easy succession. Many thought there could be no successor to Rabbi Yerucham, and it was a whole complication. Rav Leib Malin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, thought that perhaps his son, who was then living in Tel Aviv, Reb Chaim Zev Finkel, could succeed Rabbi Yerucham. The close students of Rabbi Yerucham weren't excited about that idea, to say the least, and that didn't work out. That had a messy ending, and Rabbi Chaim Zev went back to Palestine, where he only decades later became the Mashgiach in the Mir in 1954. So the compromise candidate was Reb Chatzkel Levenstein, who had previously been in the Mir, both in an informal position and even earlier when Rabbi Yerucham was stuck after World War I across the border. So Reb Chatzkel had even served as an official role as the Mashgiach in Yeshiva, so it was kind of like bringing him back to where he had previously been. So that seemed like a fair compromise. He had also moved to the land of Israel, to Palestine. He had become the Mashgiach in the Lamji Yeshiva in Petach Tikva, and now he was recalled from there to fill Rav Yerucham Levovitz's position as the Mashgiach in the Mir, as a compromise candidate for temporarily. He was called in officially for 5 years. Of course, 5 years later was 1941. They're on their way to Shanghai, and the rest is history. So Reb Chatzkel stayed with the yeshiva throughout the Shanghai years, and then in the United States, and then in their initial years in Israel, and he only moved on to the Panovich Yeshiva approximately 18 years after he had originally come, and he moved on to Panovich, where he remained for the rest of his long life. That was Reb Chatzkel Levenstein. Either way, it was complicated because everyone felt this closeness to Rabbi Yerucham, and anyone who would come in, was trying to replace someone who was seen by his students as irreplaceable. So it was always a tense situation. In fact, when Reb Leib passed away, he passed away without children. So it was Reb Chatzkel was concerned that perhaps it was a kapeda. It was some sort of issue of feelings that had been hurt in the process of him being the mashgiach there. So Reb Chatzkel Levenstein attended Rav Leib Malin's levaya, and he cried out, "Genug kapeda! It's enough! It's enough! Everything is forgiven. There's no reason for people to pass away without children so tragically at a young age." They had a mutual respect for each other, and it was never something personal. Rav Leib Malin was eventually buried right near his Rebbe, the Brisker Rov, Rav Yerucham Levovitz, in the then relatively new Chelkas Harabanim and Har HaMenuchos, where he is today. He's two kvarim near off from the Brisker Rov. He had a very close relationship with the Brisker Rov. He had studied there while he was at the Mir Yeshiva. He went on for a few years to be by the Rav, who loved him, and they were very close. And then the war comes. So the beginning of the war, the Mir Yeshiva is trying to escape from the Soviets. Right, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has the secret clause, which is only discovered at Nuremberg, but it was agreed upon by Molotov and Joachim von Ribbentrop, the two foreign ministers of Stalinist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, on August 23rd, 1939, a week before the commencement of hostilities, which was the beginning of World War II, the invasion of Poland. So they had this clause about dividing Poland. So on September 17th, Eastern Poland is invaded by the Red Army. And Eastern Poland is where all the Lithuanian-style yeshivas were. So communist atheists, they didn't allow these rabbinical Torah institutions to operate, and therefore they were escaping from the Soviets. They escaped to neutral Lithuania, and that was And that was a temporary solution because the Soviet Union eventually extended its occupation of Eastern Europe to the Baltic states, and Lithuania is incorporated into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1940. So there's this idea that perhaps they should leave the Soviet Union. Now, no one guessed that Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, no one guessed that it's coming in June 1941. So there's no escaping the Nazis. This is not Nazi-occupied Europe. This is Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe. And they're leaving the Soviets. They're trying to get away from the Soviets. And the idea that you could get visas was only possible at this time under the Soviets. You couldn't get visas if you were a Nazi-occupied country. There were no consulates in Nazi-occupied countries. You couldn't escape the Nazis that way. Once Barbarossa started, in other words, once the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, there was mass shootings of Jews right away in mass graves outside of the towns. So there was no escaping the Nazis by getting visas. They were escaping the Soviets a year before the Nazi invasion, and unless they had prophecy, they did not know that the Nazi invasion would come a year later. So they're strictly dealing with the Soviet threat. And the consensus, again, among the leading rabbis of the day, Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski and many others on the yeshiva world, Baron Kotler and many others, were not to get visas to escape the Soviet Union, because that would entail requesting Soviet exit visas. And so requesting a Soviet exit visa was very dangerous, because if you dared ask to leave the Soviet Union, and how can you leave the Soviet workers' paradise? That's counter-revolutionary, that's Trotskyism, that's God knows what else in Stalinist Soviet Union they could come up with. And therefore, it's dangerous. And again, pre-Barbarossa, before the Nazis implement the final solution, which no one anticipated, the worst thing in the world was being sent to Siberia. Of course, we know that once the final solution is implemented, so the Siberia is one of the safest places on the planet, relatively. So Siberia would have been wonderful, relatively. So, but they didn't know that at the time, right? So Siberia is pretty scary, pretty dangerous. So therefore, why ask for a Soviet exit visa? Let's try to survive under the Soviets. Let's try to keep the yeshivas maintained under the Soviets, and let's hunker down and survive. That was the consensus, and that's what the rabbis all advised. So it was pretty courageous of Rav Leib Malin to be able to go against that consensus and advise the Mir Yeshiva together as a unit to go request these visas, which included the famous Sugihara visas to Japan, which ultimately led them to Shanghai. In fact, yesterday, New Year's, January 1st, was Sugihara's birthday, his 122nd birthday. So if he would still be alive, he'd be 122. He died, 30, 40 years ago, but it's significant that it's his birthday and Rav Leib's yard site kind of coincide. Either way, so Rav Leib had this major role in guiding the yeshiva through this and taking a leadership position. When they're in Shanghai, so I once asked an Altamir, I said to him, we grew up with these legends about the Mir, the study, the diligence of the Mir students studying Torah all day and night in Shanghai, and everyone knew the entirety of Shas by heart, because the study in Shanghai was incomparable to anything the Jewish people has ever seen throughout its history. I wanted to know, is that true? That's kind of the stories that we grew up on. I asked him, you were in Shanghai, tell me if it's true. So he was a little bit dismissive. He said, who knew Shas? Rav Leib Malin knew Shas in its entirety. He said, I never fahered anyone, I never tested anyone, so it could be there were others, but I'm not sure about anyone else. Rav Leib Malin, everyone knew that he was a head and shoulders above everyone. He knew Shas. So there was a lot of refugees in Shanghai. There were thousands of refugees from all over, from Austria, from Germany, from Poland, religious, secular, Hasidic, yeshiva students, all types. The Mir Yeshiva had very little to do, if not nothing to do, with the other refugees in the mainstream community. Yet there were several marriages of Mir students that did take place, but that's a story for another time. He comes to the United States after the war, and Rav Leib Malin founds the yeshiva Bais Hatalmud, together with Reb Chaim V'Sucker, his close friend, and the student of Rav Yerucham Levovitz, of course, and a whole chabura, a whole group of senior students of Rav Yerucham. And the primary reason was that they wanted their independence. They had been financially supported by the heroic efforts of Rav Avram Kalmanovich, who had supported them throughout the war years and then brought them over to the United States. But at some point they wanted, their own independence. They wanted to do their own thing. Rav Kalmanovich was doing things his way, and they felt that their style, was Rav Yerucham Kalmanovich wasn't their role model. Their role model was Rav Yerucham Levovitz and the Mir and Kelm before that. So they wanted to start their own institution. They did not rejoin the Mir in Israel with Reb Lezer Finkel because they had no interest in going to Israel. They wanted to stay in the United States. So they had to come up with another option. And what they did was they opened then a kollel for select Altamirs. It was a small 11, 12 Altamir students, mostly unmarried, and it was not originally intended to be a yeshiva. Eventually, it evolved into a yeshiva. It started off in East New York. It moves to Bensonhurst in 1962. The neighborhood went bad. It was kind of dangerous, so they had to leave. But they were in East New York for those early years, and it was the only Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn that welcomed the yeshiva. They had elderly Jewish women who were immigrants who were willing to host the yeshiva students in their home. The Altamirs, like Reb Chaim V'Sucker, they boarded by locals. It was like a stancia, like they had in the Mir in Poland. They had a stancia, a room in someone's home. They these older men, they were respected Talmidei Chacham. They're not going to go to a dormitory, obviously. So they boarded in people's homes. Reb Chaim V'Sucker, Reb Lezer Harajewski, Reb Shmuel Charkover, people like that. Rav Leib Malin had gotten married already, as was some of the other founders, Reb Tzal Tannenbaum, Reb Leib Shachar, Reb Leib Kopenia. A lot of the Altamirs of Bais Hatalmud were already married. Shortly before his founding of Bais Hatalmud, he authored an article in a journal that he himself published to disseminate Torah and Musar. He called it Hatvuna, and he published it anonymously, but he was the one who published it, and he was the one who wrote this introduction, and it's a landmark article. It's a historic article. This is considered the article of understanding Reb Leib and his world and his view, his value system. It's an important one. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's available on Eitzar HaChachma, probably on Hebrew books too, I imagine. And it's based on this philosophy that he founded a Bais Hatalmud. I want to explore a little bit using the text of the Hatvuna article, but more to see it in a broader context. I want to explore Reb Leib's rebuilding of the yeshiva world post-war activities, especially his philosophy behind it, in a much broader context. I hope I'm not taking it too far, but I truly believe that he was a visionary who saw the big picture and that his impact was way beyond the walls of his own small, modest yeshiva of Bais Hatalmud. This, of course, does not mean to say that he was the only one who saw things this way. Presumably, the other great builders of the Lithuanian Torah world, such as Rav Aaron Kotler, the Panovich Rav Rebbe Yosef Shlomo Kahneman, and other great builders and visionaries, had similar aspirations and value systems. But this is in the context of this episode on Rav Leib Malin, who will be focusing on his role and impact. So I want to take several steps back to get a much broader context and then get back to Rav Leib. In the post-war, the world of rebuilding in both Israel and the United States, there are 2 points to consider. Number one, that the Jewish, the religious, for sure, society was very, very urban, became super, ultra-urban. The second point is that there was no longer, almost non-existent, the concept of a kehila, of the kahal, of what had existed in Europe pre-war, of very structured Jewish communities. There was no government recognition, for sure not in a place like the United States, where there's no such thing as the government recognition of an autonomous religious entity as a community, completely antithetical to the values of American society, as opposed to Europe, which, even until today, European Jewish communities are structured on that, but for sure pre-war. So religious communal identity in the United States was completely voluntary based, no requirements. Based on these 2 points, many visionaries saw institution building within very specific parameters, very specific frameworks, as a way to salvage the Jewish community and preserve it in these new conditions. And only belonging to a specific type of religious institution would maintain Jewish continuity. And I'll give an example from totally the other end of the spectrum. Very interesting byproduct of this phenomenon is the rise in synagogue membership with the move to the suburbs during the 1950s. And the type of synagogues we're talking about is Reform and conservative temples, obviously. In the suburbs, 1950s, there are no Orthodox synagogues. Yet still, while the immigrant Jews, the first and second generation, lived in Brownsville or the Bronx, they were not members. Primarily, they were not members of synagogues for the overwhelming majority, because you were Jewish enough without that in New York City. Your Jewish existence was permeating the atmosphere of the Jewish neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Bronx, and the Lower East Side. The language, the Yiddish newspapers, the Yiddish culture, the street life, the shops, it just was there. In the suburbs, you needed something else if Jewish identity was important. Of course, assimilation was rampant also, so obviously it wasn't important to everyone. But paradoxically, the next generation, which is supposed to have been more assimilated and less Jewish with the move to the suburbs in the 1950s, many of them become more affiliated, because all of a sudden they're looking to synagogue membership and even synagogue attendance, albeit Reform and conservative, right? So, that's a different type of affiliation, but it is a somewhat, can be considered a religious affiliation. So that's an interesting byproduct of this phenomenon. That being said, we now return to the refugee segment of the Jewish population, and specifically the traditional elements thereof. And if we cite some of the great Hasidic leaders as examples, Skver, Lubavitch, Bobov, Satmar, many others, Gleisenberg, many others, the courts they established in New York were attempts to create a Kehila framework with full institutional infrastructure to enable rebuilding in this urban society and within the liberal environment of the separation of church and state setting. This required a unique vision on one hand, as this was unlike anything they had known in Europe. The Kehila model had always had government recognition, though in the last generations prior to the war, the Kehila system was severely weakened and urbanization was already in full force. But either way, Hasidic courts were in a certain way uniquely suited for this purpose, because they had always been a community to a certain extent, which was not limited by geographical borders. And it has been noted by many historians of the Hasidic movement that with the weakening of the Kahal over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Hasidic court and its institutions begin to fill an ever-increasing role in what had previously been the purview of the Kahal. However, the non-Hasidic world never had that luxury. So in Germany and Hungary, the Kehila model existed right up to the war, and there were even attempts of rebuilding that Kehila model in the post-war in several locations around the world, which is an interesting story which we can explore another time. However, the Lithuanian Torah world never even made such an attempt. So a new alternative Kehila model was sought to serve as a paradigm, as an all-encompassing institution, literally taking what had been until this point an educational institution and transforming it into a lifelong identity. And this was, of course, the role that the yeshiva was supposed to play. The yeshiva, until this point, until shortly before the war, let's say, because the process had already begun pre-war, the yeshiva had been a place of Torah education. It was an educational institution. Now, it was to serve as a communal institution, a communal identity. This process had already commenced prior to the war, and we see this in the leadership and the vision, for instance, of the Altiv Slobodka, the Chavetz Chaim, and even to a certain extent in the activities of the Vada Yeshivas of Reb Chaim Isaac Grodensky, even though it was primarily for fundraising. But that's another story. In the post-war rebuilding efforts, it became a crucial part of the process. And judging from our contemporary world, it seems to have been successful both in Israel and the United States. So that is all the context. Having said all that background, I can now return to the story of Rav Leib Malin. He, perhaps more than any other, saw what he termed the tzuras hayeshiva, the form of the yeshiva, for what he envisioned it to be, and that it needed to be maintained as the lifeline for the survival of the Jewish people. The yeshiva affiliation, in his mind, was total and everlasting. The essence of the yeshiva became the essence of one's identity. This, and I'm going to bring a quote, which I translated for the Mishpacha magazine article, and it comes from the Hatavuna article that Rav Leib wrote. Really says it all. In the pre-war, the Mir Yeshiva had a group of alumni in Lodz, a major industrial city in Poland. They were laymen who formed a chabura as Mir alumni, and they maintained contact with their Rebbe from the Mir, the great Mashgiach, Rav Yerucham Levovitz. Rav Yerucham wrote them a letter, and it was shortly before his passing, and really expressed Rav Yerucham's worldview. So Rav Leib and other senior students of Rav Yerucham came to see this letter as something of a will and testament of Rav Yerucham. So this is the quote that I want to use. Who more than you is familiar with what the Tzuras HaYeshiva is to be, to dwell in the depths of study? You are all students of our holy yeshiva, and I see that aside from the vast amounts of Torah you've received from the yeshiva, which is an external accomplishment, you've come to understand and internalize the essence and the spirit of what the holy yeshiva is. To that effect, you've established a chabura, which is to continue the legacy of the yeshiva spirit. You've taken it with you wherever you go, to be constantly with the yeshiva and within the walls of the yeshiva. In addition, you can have an impact on those who have never gazed upon the walls of the yeshiva. Through their connection to you, they will also be considered talmidim of the holy yeshiva. Through this merit, you will always be considered students of the holy yeshiva for eternity. End quote. So this was understood to mean that the yeshiva was no longer to be seen as limited to Torah education, as was the case, let's say, in Volozhin Yeshiva. What Rabbi Yerucham is referring to is that he refers to the vast amounts of Torah study as an external accomplishment. And the primary focus is on what they internalize as on the essence and spirit of what the holy yeshiva is. That essence and spirit is to be taken with wherever you go, to be constantly within the walls of yeshiva for eternity. Now, this is nothing short of revolutionary, and a barometer of its success is the fact that this idea is completely taken for granted today in large swaths of the yeshiva community in both Israel and the United States. So Rav Leib carried that vision, and that's what he tried to build with Bais Hatalmud. So what we have left here is many, many stories which did not make it into the magazine article. There's many stories that just didn't have room. We didn't have room for a huge collection. Plus some other facets of his life, especially the early years and his years in Shanghai and the escape, the role that he played there. So that we'll have to save for a part 2. There's always room for a part 2. If you'd like to sponsor that, then please be in touch with me. There's so much more to say about this great man. But this was part 1 about Rav Leib Malin. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.